All right, we are sitting with Dr. Somdeep Sen, the acclaimed author of Decolonizing Palestine, among many other things. Sam, I've had the good pleasure of working closely with Sam on a number of projects. We've talked about his work, talked about the book, and we have this delightful opportunity to sit down and have a chat. So, we've come up with a couple of questions that kind of speak to the themes that we've been discussing in our class. To refresh your memory, Sam, the class is called The Praxis of Encampment, Settler Colonialism in Turtle Island and Palestine. And the class is something that emerged out of the interest of a group of students from various campuses here in Chibuktuk and Halifax, where they had occupied the Quad of Dalhousie in solidarity with Palestine, as was happening all over the world over the summer. And I believe the Al Zitoun University encampment was perhaps the longest standing encampment in Canada. It's either us or University of Victoria. And when the university decided to tear it down, we as the community decided to organize a class to kind of archive and discuss the politics and continue the project through other means. So that's the context through which the students chose. Your book, Decolonizing Palestine, was one of the treasured books in the encampment library. People were always kind of jockeying to read it. So we thought we'd include it obviously as one of our core texts. So yeah, welcome, Sam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for all the amazing work that everyone's been doing, especially the students. I mean, I just turned 40 a couple of weeks ago, so it makes sense to be all gloomy and negative. I think it goes with my age, but it's just really nice and refreshing to see the way the students have been at it for more than a year now. So it's really inspirational. So thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I enjoyed when I was reading your book actually was actually the realization by the end of the book that we're the same age and like thinking about the gloom and the optimism and stuff. So I hear you on the 40 bit.
Mm.
So let's kick off. We'll jump right into it. So the students in the class were intrigued at your framing of Hamas needing to occupy the space of the post-colonial and the anti-colonial at the same time. Can you tell us a little more about how you came to this insight?
Um, yeah, I mean the anti-colonial part, was very much out of a sense of frustration with regards to what we had in terms of this book is an extension of my doctoral project, right? So what we had in terms of the existing literature, where this is only, I started my PhD, 10 years after 9/11. So a lot of the literature was dominated by the political Islam framework.
Hmm.
2011, again, we're sort of coming into the Arab Spring years, which means again that dominates the narrative. Yet the some of the things that were being said within that literature on Islam and the Islamicness of Hamas wasn't really jiving with the literature I was reading about liberation movements, which was also my interest. So this sort of confusion is what I went into the field with. And then one realizes, and I have this insight or this ethnographic anecdote at the start of the book of trying to enter Gaza. And, there is this sort of overwhelming weight of the context, right? When you arrive there, where you have the liberation context dominates, right? And it's very difficult to escape that, even though in the classroom, in the books, we're being told, Hamas, Islam, and political Islam, right?
Hmm.
So, and then when I started doing my interviews in Gaza, it ends up being, a lot of the language that Hamas officials were using were not very different historically, if you look at some of the narratives of liberation struggles. So, the anti-colonial part sort of, came from that. And obviously, I've gotten a lot of pushback on that as well. I mean, right now it seems sort of, especially among your students, it may seem not that far of a stretch, but, in a largely white Eurocentric political science department, this was, and being the brown guy talking about Fanon, this was, pretty far out. the post-colonial was also the sense of like, again, it comes a lot from the field, right? I mean, one of the things that, I talk about, I'm not entirely sure at this point if it's in the book, but I talk a lot about having to buy, in book talks, I talk about having to buy a suit when I went to meet Hamas officials. And I was like, wait a minute. I mean, you're supposed to be the resistance. Why am I having to dress up, right? I didn't pack a suit on my trip to Gaza, unfortunately. But, it was very interesting that persona of a state-like authority, which was very much imposed on the Gaza Strip, right? Imposed on Palestine, where, the Oslo Accord dictated that the Palestinian revolutionary now start acting like a state builder, right? Like a bureaucrat. So Hamas somehow took that on, and so I had to wear a suit to meet these Hamas officials, yet they were using that language of resistance, right? And
Mhm.
it's that sort of, very much ethnographic everyday encounter of between what is familiar or what seems, incongruous with the times, which is sort of this performance of postcoloniality, is is how it sort of came about. And of course, as I write in the book as well, there is a history of this, right? If you look at trajectories of liberation movements where that performance of being able to govern and be a people and be organized is another way of claiming that we have a right. Of course, then you're feeding into all the liberal state building narratives and discourses of in a very hierarchical international political system. But nonetheless, that is part of that performance as well of the liberation struggle.
I mean, I see what you mean. I mean, that performativity of the suit. The suit is so important as liberation struggles seek kind of global legitimacy. It reminds me of even the liberation tigers of Tamil Ilam, when Volupalai Prabhakaran all of a sudden took off the fatigues in the 90s and put on the suit and started having press conferences in the jungle and stuff.
Mm.
But these symbols of the state and of the familiar, safe, liberal state, it does seem to be at critical times in revolutionary struggles a very important, whether it's a symbol or an actual bureaucracy or.
But it's also about, how it's to prove that if liberation happens, if independence happen, things aren't going to just fall apart into anarchy. One of the things
Absolutely.
that I remember, I used to have this internship at Oxfam when the tsunami hit in Sri Lanka.
Right.
And people were amazed about how efficient and how much more efficient the Tamil Tigers were compared to the Sri Lankan state and how organized they were in terms of aid delivery and facilitating access to development organizations. So,
Hmm.
yeah, agreed.
Full-time cadres, right? They're very organized, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Awesome. So the next question I had for you was, it occurred in our class discussions that sometimes it seems easier for people in the West to applaud anti-colonial violence when it's happening in the past, but not so much when it's happening in the present. How do you think history will remember, the last year and a half in particular?
I mean, uh, that's a tough one, right? Because I feel like in the last few years, we've witnessed a crash course in political hypocrisy, the hypocrisy of the liberal world order. I mean, I live in Denmark where a few years ago, we were taking jewelry away from Syrian refugees.
Mm,
Yet we opened our doors to white refugees that came in. Just a few months ago, we were sort of, talking very highly about a white people resisting, while when it comes to Palestine, we didn't. So, something that I've I'm coming to terms with is how tolerant we are in this part of the world when it comes to how tolerant we are towards extreme levels of violence and suffering when it is inflicted on racialized bodies. We have a lot of patience for that, right? And this is not just in Palestine. I was privileged enough to be able to travel to South Africa in November last year, which was a wild experience to be in South Africa, do these tours of Soweto, and then watching what's happening in Gaza.
mm-hmm.
One of the things that struck me was the Soweto uprising, which was sort of this and which was met with the utmost brutality of the apartheid state. And you have this very famous picture of the teenager Hector Peterson's lifeless body being carried. That was 1976. A week after that started, Kissinger met the South African president and didn't bring up the uprising at all,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And of course, that sort of that's strange to watch that happen or read about that and, look at the exhibits in Soweto and then think about how Bill Clinton talked to the electorate in Michigan, or Biden's recent response regarding, I don't know if you saw with the journalist asking, what would it take for you to, call for a ceasefire? And he said something like, what would it take for the camera to hit you in the head or something like that,
Oh
right?
my God,
The
no.
the casual, the cavalier manner in which we're able to sweep it aside, when it comes to violence on racialized, inflicted on racialized body. I mean, I knew about the hypocrisy, but you're seeing it as almost real time.
Mm.
So, I expect that, 20, 30 years from now, just the way everyone is, we're told that everyone was anti-apartheid South Africa, apparently, right? I think we're going to see the same thing. 30 years from now, people are going to say the same thing, except, we're in a digital age. Everything is screenshotted and saved and archived and documented. And we know very well that all those anti-apartheid people worked very, the West was very much complicit in keeping up the apartheid regime until 1990, right? We have the tools to do, to research how the money travels, how the political support travels, the networks of lobbying. So I think that all the work that's being done is going to be used 20, 30 years later to, you know, to speak up against those people who are apparently anti-genocide.
Right. Yeah,
So,
absolutely. I mean, I'm just envisioning, like, you can see it happening. I see even on a smaller scale, like, because every time there's a massive internationally focused attention on Israeli violence in Palestine, things have always, obviously this is the biggest one in recent years, but even all these other ones, once the dust has settled, everybody likes to talk about how they were opposed to it, but you never see them in the streets. You never see them actually speaking in the here and now. This is going to
no,
be a
I mean, some of them have actively worked again. I mean, when after October 7th, many on the left have actively worked to discipline how Palestine solidarity activists and how you speak about, the
Mm.
issues at hand about history and so on and so forth. So, visualize myself being in my 60s or something, and, my kids saying, this guy is a good guy. I'm like, you know what? Back in 2024, this is what he did and this is what he said, right?
You need to know that. Absolutely, yes.
Exactly.
Okay, our next question here. Our class, as I mentioned before, it's comprised of students. They come from five different universities, so they kind of forged this solidarity agreement for an encampment called Al Zaytun University. And they lasted about 80 days. While they were there, I mean, I can't speak highly enough about this crew. It's one of the reasons why I teach the class. We draw so much inspiration from the energy that these students produce. They hosted teach-ins, they held press conferences, they did lots of direct actions, but they also, I remember hearing students say that they'd never been more food secure than when they were sleeping outside, because the community and themselves were actually organizing kitchens, and it was actually a wonderful thing, challenging and awful thing, but in so doing, bringing together a broad community, and steadfastly demanding that the university boycott, divest, and sanction. Now, most of these students, almost all of them actually, were undergraduate students. They're very young, especially compared to old guys like me and you. And I'm wondering if you had any advice of a methodological or an ethical or a political nature that you think that these young scholars should keep in mind as they develop their own research projects around questions related to Palestine, postcolonialism, decoloniality, and anti-coloniality.
Um, yeah, one of the things that I often tell my students is to beware of the title of scientificness
Hmm.
and also beware of the charge of non-scientificness, right? And how that is weaponized to blunt the politics of your work, right?
Hmm.
And that's, we were part of a special issue on decolonizing IR, and that's something I talk about there, where, these sort of titles are often used to make you circumvent um, or from addressing some of the central challenges of our world today. And academics are really good at that. Political scientists are really good at that. And I often see that where I read a, a an academic text where I'm like, well, the themes are really interesting and relevant, yet you are very skillfully, you
Hmm.
know, avoiding the key empirical data points that really show the relevance of your work today.
Hmm.
And I grew up in Calcutta, so I'm used to crowded places, and I know how people skillfully avoid and squeeze through tight spaces.
Right.
So it just seems it just so oftentimes I feel that we are structurally forced to avoid these central questions, and it's important for students and academics as well to remember that science is political, right? um, and this, structurally where various disciplines come from, especially political science and international relations. But I think it's also important to think about, think about the choices that you make, both empirically,
Hmm.
what you're choosing to study, and theoretically, what kind of theoretical choices that you're making, all have political implications in terms of how you theorize and understand a problem at hand, right? Um, there's also the question of politics and ethics intertwined with methods.
Hmm.
And I'm not talking about sort of the, ethical stuff that we have to fill out before doing field work. I'm talking about what kind of methods you choose. Um, my book would have been would be entirely different if I had taken the advice of that head of the PhD school who said that, well, political scientists don't do field work, and that you can't go because insurance wouldn't cover you, or things like that, right? Political scientists do desk work, is what I was told. So obviously, if I had followed his advice and not called the insurance company to see if I'm covered or not, um, that's one little step, but the book would have been completely different. I would have been a completely different scholar, and my work would have been in a different world. So again, like, that's methods and talking to people and trying to understand their viewpoint, the world they live in, is so important. And that, a lot of times, that's sort of the key that helps make sense of a wide variety of realities. So I think that it's very important for students to be aware of, these sorts of political implications of their work, rather than, feel like political science. I mean, sometimes when we go to ISA, it's just a big performance of, it's so bureaucratized often. I mean, I'm in Denmark, it's especially, I'm like, what, you're a PhD student, why do you have cufflinks on? It's a Wednesday. But, that's sort of, it's the
Yeah.
performance of it becomes so much important than the work that you actually do. So it's important to think about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks for that. I mean, it reminds me kind of just like you have you read Clifford Geertz's Balinese cockfight on the
Yeah.
anthropological method? Like sometimes you have to actually run from the cops with people before you can actually understand where they're coming from. I often think that political science as a discipline in particular is almost anti-person, like at least in that mainstream computational approach.
Yeah, I had this Croatian friend of mine. We went to grad school together,
Mhm.
and he at some point was, he said that, when systems, laws, policies don't work, it's not the policy's problem, it's the people's problem. And political science is that way. You have these sort of grand arguments about how things work, and then people just don't fit. Not
Right.
that the your argument is the issue. And that's the thing. I mean, I took a lot of inspiration from anthropology because my mother-in-law is an anthropologist. So it just happened to be that when I was writing my methods chapter, I was, staying at my in-laws. They were traveling somewhere. Anyways, I just sort of basically raided her, bookshelf
So, oh, that's amazing.
to get different insights, because I had the additional challenge where I had to now prove to political scientists who do quant stuff why ethnography provided me certain insights that other maybe quantitative desk methods wouldn't couldn't. So I took a lot of insights from the from anthropology, and somehow didn't call it anthropology, just said to understand politics, you have to, right?
Mhm. But I think there's
So,
a really valuable lesson in what you just described there off the cuff too, which is like seek your education where it presents itself, right? You weren't formally schooled in that, and you found yourself surrounded by anthropological texts and you read them. Like, I mean,
yeah.
I think that's an important scholarly device.
I mean, I come from a liberal arts background, right? And we are in at a liberal arts school in the US. You're required to be interdisciplinary, right?
Mhm.
Of course, it was only ironically, when I got to the PhD level, I suddenly saw these like daunting disciplinary boundaries, which
Mhm.
was like, this is a political science theory, and this isn't. And I was confused because I thought you're trying to solve a problem or understand a problem in the world.
Mhm.
Why do those boundaries, why are the boundaries taking the precedence over what you're trying to understand? So, yeah, it was a very confusing time for me as a PhD because, again, brown guy. I would think I was the first international student, PhD student they had hired ever.
Right, right.
And then I'm doing Palestine, I'm doing Gaza, I'm doing Hamas, and I'm doing, Fanon.
But no,
So
on top of it.
go figure, right?
Maybe that's actually a good segue to another question I wanted to talk about, which was I remember when the book came out, you were invited to give some talks in Scotland, and there was a huge kerfuffle. There were letters that had to be circulated, people trying to cancel the talk. What's it like being a brown guy from Calcutta writing about Gaza through a Fanonian lens, and Hamas in particular, and trying to talk about this work in the public? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I mean, it's very anxiety inducing, right?
Yeah.
In the sense that when I write, usually I don't think about how things are gonna look because I'm the brown guy, all those things you said, right? Um, I just think that, I'm being honest in terms of my writing, and I'm trying to honestly depict the world, but it's very anxiety inducing. You realize how much you can't say because of the way you look, and what that does to your place in the discipline, your place in academia. And how, I mean, the older when I was younger, it, I could deal with it, but I think more and more it's actually having a psychological effect on me. So I can feel myself sometimes, I'm talking to you, you're a friend, so I don't feel anxiety here.
Mhm.
But, depending on where I am and what time of the day you catch me, I can get super anxious, right?
Yeah.
So, and I remember recently was invited for a book talk somewhere, and I was in India at the time. And I don't know, it just caught me at the wrong moment. And I had this sort of spiraling thought about, what the attacks are going to be and so on and so forth. And I immediately had like a panic attack, which, I hadn't tried before. I mean, I don't recommend. I had my first one at 39. I was in an air conditioning car in Bombay, and I just started like sweating. And even the guy driving me was like, "Are you okay? Like, what's going on?" So it's very anxiety inducing. It's not something I was just talking to a friend recently about it, where I don't recommend it to anyone. It's just sort of, I feel like I'm on that, like, the boulder on the slope of the hill, just, keep going, because I don't know how else to approach it.
Mhm.
I can see why people avoid talking about issues like this, because it's takes a lot out of you. I mean, I have small children, a lot of the attacks are directed towards my family as well. So I have to constantly these days, make choices about where I speak, how much I speak, what kind of places I talk. I have a column in Al Jazeera where I write about not just Palestine, but also Hindu nationalism in India, which has additional, sort of attacks. I've had, you
Mhm.
know, authorities showing up to my parents' house. So, it's a lot of, the older I've gotten, I've had to be a little more, in the last 3 or 4 years, it's very incessant, it's continuous.
Mhm.
Every time I write, something happens, someone records it and then, puts it out or says something. And I've had talks that have been entirely recorded, and
No
then they've
questions,
just sort
right?
of moved without permission, and then they have moved. Of course, they didn't put up the recording, but they've moved things around, right? Even the Glasgow thing, after that, BISA, Brismas, ISA, our EISA academic associations came together to host a public talk. But then, Neve Gordon, who, was very instrumental to supporting me there, um, he was like, we need to make sure we record it because people tend to edit
Yes.
and, things around. So it becomes very stressful even speaking, right? I mean, recently I spoke at a university in Vienna where the university authorities called the police right before, right? So if you have 40, 50 people in the audience, 50 online or whatever the numbers were, right before you go up and you're talking about these sorts of issues, it's very difficult. It's very, like I said, anxiety inducing, but,
That happened to Mark. I asked the other day too. He was speaking at York in Toronto, and before he even started, people had called the cops, and cops turned up at his talk. Like, I mean, yeah. I mean, it's so vivid, especially about Palestine. I mean, Hindutva is a whole other vicious can of,
right.
but yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for that. Zoom is telling me we've got about 5 minutes left. I had one extra question before I let you go, if you have the time, which is, obviously the book was written in 2022. Would it have changed much if it was coming out next year instead?
I mean, I guess I don't think so. I mean, I would have, once I made the choice to write about Hamas, Fanon, and all of that, I don't think I would have changed much. I think one of the things I would have clarified maybe is one of the things that comes up is that do I feel or do I believe that the state is, the ultimate goal of liberation, right? And why am I tying liberation to state building? And, if people sort of read all the way through, you can see that when I talk about at the end, I'm fairly critical of it, right? But state building and state building processes. So I think that maybe that's something I would have sort of clarified,
Right.
that the reason I'm talking about the state is, with the Oslo Accords, is this overwhelming pressure that's put on the Palestinian liberation movement, the national movement, from the international community.
Mhm.
So, and state building continues a very, potent force when it comes to development aid and so forth. So I think, I'm taking a critical lens, but nonetheless, to understand how these forces work. I think the other thing that maybe, I don't know if I would change, but something that, sometimes comes up is that, what do you think of is liberation, right? And
Right.
the book, if I think about it, is like quite antsy, right? In the sense that, if you think about it, it's like, it's a very personal book. I talk about my grandfather and so on and so forth, towards the end, if people get to the end. And I wanted to keep it slightly open-ended in terms of, what I think the trajectory of a liberation struggle could be. Because a lot of times it's an unending process. It doesn't make sense. A lot of the aspects of my being doesn't make sense, right? As someone who's grown up in India, where you're told to, idealize the West, idealize the white people, idealize a place like the UK. Every time I go to the UK, if you look at the work conditions and healthcare and especially in the university sector, pension, I'm like, how is this a thing, right? But then, you still think of, oh, the UK,
Right.
England, what been taught, right?
God's country.
It's I would maybe in the language I would clarify that it's a very personal book as well, and what I write afterwards is not going to be that way.
Mhm.
But recently someone, obviously the book often gets, I'm lucky enough to get a lot of positive feedback, but every now and again, someone will write, someone wrote recently in Italian that this is the problem with the European left intellectual. They can't give clear answers about what something is and what isn't, right? And obviously, the most offensive part of that accusation was that he accused me of being European. But,
I love it.
but maybe I would make my intentions much more clearer and show that it's much more of a personal sort of book. Obviously, it's a first book, right? You're a early career scholar, so you want to show that you are an academic with the university press book, right?
And
So
everybody
that's
tells you that,
right.
right? Like when you're, I understand what you mean. Like coming from dissertation to book, it's like there's so much anxiety, and you feel that you're not allowed to have anything of yourself in that book, right? Because that's what the profs told you, but it's so
Right.
wrong. But you have to
Yeah,
write the book to know that it's wrong, and then know that you
exactly.
do it different.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And oftentimes people don't even read all the way to the
Yeah.
end of the book. I mean, it's only recently when the book was translated into Italian, and then someone asked me before a book talk, he's like, well, you talk about your grandfather at the end of the book. Do you mind if we talk about it? I'm like, yes, it's there in the book to, for people to talk about. But, people, especially in academia, people don't read, they're just like looking for what they're interested in or what they want to criticize, right? So the book is extremely personal, and maybe if I was, a bit older and a bit more experienced, I would have the confidence to
Hmm.
say that much more explicitly, rather than, I'm talking about my grandfather, so obviously it's personal, but it's still a bit subtle and implicit in there. So yeah.
But I appreciate you saying that, especially in the context of this talk for, my class, right? Because the way our class was designed, we read The Colonial Present by Derek Gregory. We read Advocating for Palestine in Canada, another like edited volume, but a whole book. And we read your book. And then the book forum that Shari organized. And articles that Ayash wrote and like lots of stuff around it. But the class was organized around reading books cover to cover. And I feel that your point that even scholars are not reading books cover to cover, but I really think that a message for the students here is you need to read some of these books cover to cover to understand the entirety of the arguments. So this is why we beg you to read in the classes, you know?
I mean, I really appreciate that because, as you know, and you've just published a wonderful book, that it takes a lot of time. And at least in your head as an author, it's a story you're trying to tell that's, again, cover to cover. And you
Mhm.
can't just pick one um, to critique or make your argument or position yourself or whatever. So I really appreciate that, students, it's hard to make students read entire books. So I appreciate what you're doing.
These students, it's easy, these are the cream of the crop style students, but Zoom is telling us they're about to kick us off. So I did want to formally thank you, Dr. Sen, for your time. I really appreciate it. And remind you to go pick up your kids. See
Thanks, man.
you, Sam. See you soon.
Yeah. Cheers. Bye.